Want to come in, please? Okay. I know the snacks are good, but not that good. Come on, it's just chips. Come on in. Okay. Okay. Are we ready? We've gone through several themes today. One of the themes we've gone through is what is the issue of consciousness? What are the big ticket issues we're looking at? That was one of the themes. What are the big tickets? What's the big picture from a point of view of microtubulars and neurology, a point of view of metaphysics? Asking, what would research look like if consciousness was its own entity to look at? Then we looked at examples of folks looking, what areas might you develop in the research? And I realize some of this is very early in process, and it hasn't reached its maturation yet it gives so much room for thought. Now we're moving on to a very important session, and the next speaker we have is, even though it's near the end of the day, there's a reason for that. It's probably one of the most important talks we're going to hear today. And the general topic is relevance, communication, and public perception. I was having lunch with Dr. Hameroff, and we were discussing the problem of artificial intelligence. There was a time when the metaphor was the telegraph, then the telephone, and then finally the computer. When all of these networks get together, it emulates what consciousness is. And in each generation, the sci-fi movies came out with first the telegrams, the telegraph, or the telephone would all get together and start talking to each other and take over the world. And that metaphor is still present, but now it's gone the supercomputer, the artificial intelligence. As Dr. Hameroff demonstrated last night, not even close, and as other speakers have demonstrated, not even possible. And Dr. Hameroff made a major breakthrough, and he is not welcome at artificial intelligence conferences for that reason. Not at all. And he was telling me how he went to Stanford to speak, and there was a protester. So that is a compliment, and he saw it that way. So now we come to the point of a conference, very important. How do we communicate with the world, with folks, that maybe consciousness has to be looked at differently? It's relevant for scientists. That's how you get grants. Templeton now is giving a grant to explore consciousness. It's relevant in science departments. If you want to look at it, we want to look at it with a different paradigm. It's relevant in our everyday life. But how do you have this dialogue between spirituality, sometimes between metaphysics and the physicalist world? As Dr. Resnick spoke about this morning, it's a complex issue. And metaphysics, if we're talking to non-philosophers about metaphysics, it's difficult. So how do we communicate concepts? So this session will talk about that. Now, our first speaker has come all the way from a long, long way, and that is Tom Aechtner. Tom has come, he's a Canadian, which is what I tell people nowadays if they ask where I'm from. But And he might really be an American and just said he's Canadian too. We don't know that yet, but we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt of being a Canadian who's at the University of Queensland. He's a senior lecturer in religion and science, which is so relevant. His interests is focus on mainly religious-motivated vaccine hesitancies, especially in Africa, where there's a religious push not to do vaccines for religious reasons, but for the science says you darn well better do it. He's working on a project of improving vaccination rates in Australia, analyzing media, religion, and policy. He's really quite an expert on these topics. So it's really going to be one of our most important lectures. I'd like everyone to give it their maximum attention. I'm going to talk about the other speakers. Next speaker he's going to have will be his student, Oliver Zambon. Oliver is a graduate student doing his PhD under Tom in similar areas. And then we're going to have Stuart Kreitzer speaking. Now, Stuart's a cool guy. I went to his dissertation defense, and the chair said, best she ever heard. But he can present it in the folksiest of ways. So you're going to enjoy his talk. And just to get the right title here, he's going to be speaking on Foundations of the Bhaktivedanta Institute. He's done the Institute sponsoring this. Why are we doing this? What are our foundations? And all of us scientists in the Institute are standing on the shoulders of our late colleague, Richard Thompson, who was a giant. So if we look tall, it's because we're on his shoulders. And his books are out there. He's done so many books, so many great intellectual pursuits, and the archivist of that is Stuart. So we'll begin with Tom Aechtner speaking on enhancing religious science communication. Stuart's going to go on the foundations of the Institute. Oliver Zambon's going to do Vaishnavism, Anti-Evolution, and Ambiguities, revisiting ISKCON's own dilemma of just talking about evolution. And both Tom and Oliver have just published a major article in one of the most major journals, Zygon, a very, very significant piece of work. And finally, we're going to have Ravi Gupta speak on, can empirical observation influence scriptural testimony? And he's going to reference that with works from Jiva Gosvami. Now, Ravi is an interesting person. He went to college, I think he was 14, 12 years old. He started college, graduated by 15, went on to Oxford, one of the youngest people there ever to get a PhD. But then he decided he'd get married, so it'd keep him humble. His resume is extremely impressive. It goes on for pages and pages. Right now, he's in Department of History and Religion, if I have it right, in Utah. Excuse me? You're head of the department. Utah State University, and you're head of the department. Director of Religious Studies. Congratulations. Okay, and so that's after the talks, then we're going to have, again, a panel discussion. Again, we ask you to fill out a card, or if you don't have a card, we can call on you and repeat the question. We'll have a few questions. After that, we're going to have a dinner, because conferences make us all hungry. After the dinner, for those who still have stamina, I'll repeat the announcements later. We're going to have some book signings in the corner there. We're going to have a little musical interlude on the piano. We're going to have a poster session in room 105 for some who couldn't make it, wanted to present. We're going to have some movies showing, and I'm going to talk about the movies later on just at the break time. And one of the movies will be Brenda Dunn's Peer Project. We're going to Pair. We're going to be showing that. We're going to be showing an award-winning movie on the Yamuna River, and we'll talk a little more about that. Tomorrow afternoon, Brenda has appointments tomorrow morning, for those who know, a meeting with Mickey Singer. And then she's going to come back in the afternoon if we don't wear her out too much. And we're going to add some breakout discussion. We'll add it to the schedule because a lot of people have said, I got to understand, what's this Pair Project about? I mean, I've been fascinated by it since I first heard about it 15 years ago. And so that's our schedule for the day. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Tom.
All right, good evening. How you doing? Well, I figure it's afternoon. Sorry? Are you going to control it? We don't have a PowerPoint? Oh, thanks.
Little technical problem, which all of you now have to give us a lot of good intention for a moment.
It's going to get the PowerPoint working.
Well, you all know this one, but when the impersonal meditator went to order a pizza, which kind did he order? I'll have one with everything. Okay. Make me one with everything. Thanks. I got to get a better writer. I'll talk about the movie for a minute while they cue. One of the holiest rivers in India, the Yamuna, has been stolen and replaced by sewage. When the Yamuna River enters New Delhi, all the water, before it enters Delhi, coming from the Himalayas, all the water is sucked out, and all of it is replaced with sewage. The 23% of the children in the area suffer from lead and arsenic poisoning. This is a terrible, terrible happening. And our own Krishna Leela, who's an award-winning filmmaker as well as a PhD, and she's here today doing the interviews, has made a film called The Stolen River. It's a documentary tracing some basically kids from a school who make it their project to understand who stole their river and what happened, interviewing government officials and scientists. It's a fascinating adventure. I was there for the initial screening of it. We're going to be showing it right after the dinner. The second thing we're going to have after dinner, for those who can last, is we have our own Gungi is coming, and she is a classical Odissi dancer. She's immersed herself in the South Asian sacred dance for over 15 years, studying under the guidance of some of the top people. She's performed in over 10 countries, in 5 continents, and not only does she combine the art, but she introduces aspects of the Odissi tradition into her own Bhakti yoga tradition she was brought up in. And about 8 o'clock, for those who are still around, and I hope you will be, she'll do a performance that's worth seeing. And again, we'll have the book signing, and in room 105, some paintings, poster. Our goal is based on the work of Stuart Hameroff. Our goal is to make you all feel, when you get in your bed tonight, like you just had a maximum dose of anesthesia. And sleep like absolute babies without any disturbance whatsoever, but not Michael Jackson style, because that didn't work. So we're trying to do that. Let me see, how do we stand?
We're good.
Oh, we're ready. Okay, I just do my monologue to you're up.
That's all right.
This is actually one of the most important talks. I appreciate you.
All right. How you doing? All right. I am Canadian, Bob. An actual Canadian. Well, look, I just thought I'd start by formally thanking Bob and his team. You guys have been great hosts. Last year when Bob emailed me about this conference, invited me to this conference, it was in relation to that paper that Oliver and I published last year. And when I received the invitation, my first thought was that Bob hadn't calculated the risks of inviting me here. Firstly, because the heavy lifting, the real research heavy lifting on that project was done by Oliver, not by myself, so he'll be presenting on that. And the second reason was that I've never published anything to do with consciousness. Never had any research area at all related to consciousness, still haven't, and don't plan on it. So there's that issue. So now you're wondering why I'm here. Anyway, in the email that I sent back to Bob, I said this, quote, "I worry that my research area may have little to offer towards the conference goals of investigating consciousness. And I said, I fear in the end that I will have wasted your time, which is not something I would be keen on doing," which is a Canadian way of saying thanks but no thanks. In the end, Bob's response, if I'm paraphrasing, was, "Sounds great. Love to have you." So I was like, I have nothing to do with this conference at all. Don't think I can come. Wonderful. Love to have you. And so, you know, as is common, I think, with me, that caused a moment of awkwardness, as I feel right now, as you're contemplating why you're here listening to me. And as I'm apt to do in moments of awkwardness is that I babble and tell odd stories. So here's one. A few weeks ago in Australia, I went to see a movie with a good friend of mine. As we're wont to do, we see whatever superhero movies coming out. There was one coming out. And he invited a number of his friends that I didn't know to watch the movie with us. And as we were waiting in line to buy our tickets and head into the theater, you know, the inevitable sorts of questions were asked among this group. You know, how was your day? What have you been up to? And then there's the question of, to me, what do you do for a living? And that's a question that I sometimes hesitate to answer, especially when I'm talking to people of religious faith, in fact, of which I am, by the way. But the reason that I'm sometimes tentative about this question is because my research has largely been focused on studying the persuasion media tactics of anti-evolutionists, so people opposed to evolutionary theory, as well as media tactics of pro-evolutionists, those actively trying to support evolutionary theory to the public. And a central question that I've sought to answer in my work is why people are skeptical of well-established consensus science, such as the theory of biological evolution or the safety and efficacy of vaccines. And that's where the problem lies when I'm in a movie theater talking to people I've never met before. Because when I get asked about my work on public transit or at the theater or in whatever community group, problems tend to arise. And it's because many people that I meet happen to be skeptical of evolution, or they're skeptical of anthropogenic climate change, or they're skeptical about the safety and efficacy of vaccines, which is also one of my research areas. So when people find out what I research, it is sometimes the case that it ends conversations rather abruptly. So it's kind of like, what do you do? And then it's like, oh. Or it sparks up rather aggressive conversations, more often than not when I'm talking to other people of religious faith, frequently with people associated with my own Christian tradition. And these conversations can be interrogative, kind of testing where I stand on issues. Like, so what do you really think about this and that? And in the case of being at the movies that day, a few weeks ago, one of the individuals that I met that night continued to ask me about my work. And that's, again, usually done sort of askance, like, what do you do? It was side glances. Really? And you're married? And then he just came out with it that night before we went into the movies, and he said, do you study and accept the false science of evolution? And often from there, people start to pitch questions regarding what they think are knockdown arguments against evolutionary theory. And that's the type of response I've become accustomed to receiving since I was an undergrad studying biological evolution at the University of Alberta 20 years ago, to present to the present day when I go to local churches or I meet people in the community for the first time. University of Alberta, Jonathan Banks, shout out. Oh yeah. And if I'm honest, I have skepticism fatigue. So I'm in a state of skepticism fatigue as I receive these sorts of reactions on a daily basis, on airplanes, in fact, flying to Florida. But I suspect that many of you might actually be asking the same sorts of questions regarding evolutionary theory that people ask me, or have skeptical views about consensus science, such as evolutionary theory. And at the same time, perhaps there are some of you here today who work in the sciences, or who have had scientific training, who potentially are less decided on evolutionary theory. And maybe there's some of you that are quite convinced of the empirical basis and explanatory power of biological evolution, but aren't yet sure how to best raise the topic or discuss evolutionary theory with your friends or colleagues who may be opposed to it. Look, whatever your opinion about evolutionary theory might be, I will say from the outset that I respect your intellectual capacities. And it's my hope that no matter what your attitudes towards consensus science are, that you will be able to gain something from this presentation today. So as I noted, much of my work has been dedicated to studying Darwin's skeptic mass media and the goal of delineating the sorts of persuasive tactics that can be identified in Christian young earth creationist, as well as intelligent design theory media. Well, I've also looked at the aspects of Islamic creationist claims and new atheist arguments for evolution that are used against religion, as well as religious pro-evolutionist communications. And just to give you, the quick and dirty introduction, I'll just throw up a graph there to demonstrate my credibility. My work uses the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion, which is presented visually here. And it's generally considered the most accepted model for describing how people are persuaded via communications. And look, all that you really need to know is that there are two avenues that are described that are part of this persuasion technique. So there's the central route, the central processing route, and through that avenue of persuasion, a person is faced with a persuasive communication and critically analyzes it and deconstructs it and looks at every piece of the argument and then makes a decision one way or the other. The other route, however, is called the peripheral route of persuasion. And as it turns out, this is the route that we follow most of the time. And with the peripheral route of persuasion, we tend to rely on heuristics, on peripheral cues to make a quick decision regarding the persuasive communication. So does the person have a degree from a prestigious university? Well, maybe then I can trust them. Is this person wearing a lab coat? You know, these sorts of things. And while, you know, ideally we'd all like to think that we follow the central route of persuasion, most researchers identified that we just don't have the motivation or the time or, let's say, the ability. We're not always educated in every topic that we're presented with. You know, most of us don't, many people don't know how an internal combustion engine works, and yet we make decisions about cars, you know, without understanding the full science and engineering behind vehicles. So we make these decisions based on, you know, price and make and model and these sorts of things. So in the end, we often follow the peripheral route of persuasion. And so my research looked at peripheral cues that have been identified for decades now that tend to function within this elaboration likelihood model and tend to convince people, and they can function peripherally, and sometimes these cues then also spark central route processing. And my work has looked at these 13 persuasive cues in mass media, in what I call evolution wars mass media. So looking at things like arousal of fear, asking questions, and so here I'll just give you a very brief primer on some of these cues, which are quite recurrent and that I identify. So some of these include source cues, so messenger credibility, right? So is the person claiming to have prestigious degrees from significant, and there's been a number of studies, by the way, done on messenger credibility. I tell my undergrad students about these. So, you know, you get a group of students into a classroom, 200 students, and you get the same person presents a topic on a particular, something relevant to the students, maybe. Those students leave, and, you know, the same person gives us talk to another 200 students, but in one case, the person is described as having, you know, a degree from a very prestigious university, and in the other case, the exact same individual giving the exact same speech does not have any prestigious degrees. And of course, the people are significantly more persuaded by that same individual when he has prestigious degrees. Incidentally, if it's a male, they also interpret that person as being taller. So after the fact, they say, oh, this guy from Harvard, yeah, he was 6'1". And then the first time, oh, he had a master's degree from University of Queensland. Yeah, he was like 5'10", you know, these sorts of things. So I'm like 6'7". And that's messenger credibility. And then we get source attraction. This is where we have, you know, someone, a celebrity, for instance, may increase appeal of a product. Or if a person shares the same values as you, that tends to attract people. Even if the person, by the way, has the same name as you, you tend to be more amenable to what that person is selling. So be cautious about that. Asking questions, so asking intention questions, for instance, asking what a person intends to do in the future tends to trigger a response that they're more likely to respond and then follow through with that prediction. So they're more likely to over-predict what they're going to do and then follow through. And then rhetorical questions, of course, the use of rhetorical questions in advertising. Contrast principle, negativity effect. This is just simply the case that the characteristics of one item are accentuated much more if they're compared with another item, right? So this is just in fact, contrast advertising has been found to be so effective that it is often regulated or illegal in many countries because it tends to be so. This is where we get before and after pictures, right? You're much more likely to be convinced by a before and after picture than if you just saw one picture. And the negativity effect I attach to this, and this is that negative information tends to be much more salient or memorable or influential than is positive information. Social consensus, you know, this is just the idea. This is playing upon a majority of people. So you say, you don't need to convince people that an idea is correct. You just need to convince people that a majority of people believe that the idea is correct, and that can be often quite persuasive. And then there's that social proof or multiple sources, and then we get underdog effects. There's a little bit of a reversal of that, is you can actually persuade people by not convincing that a majority of people are behind a position, but that a valiant minority is behind a certain position. statistics and technical jargon. This is one thing that the cosmetic industry has been selling and using for years and years. Just the use of statistics and technical jargon tends to indicate expertise to people. So when you throw up statistics, this many people do this many people do that, most people lack the numeracy to understand what statistics actually mean. And so they use statistics as an indicator of expertise, and then they look for then the person's messenger credibility. Same with technical jargon. Here are two others, the scarcity principle. So we tend to judge the value of a product by its availability. Right? And as the availability decreases, we tend to increase the value of that product. And likewise, censorship tends to increase people's interest in ideas. So if I say to you, oh, look, I've got this great paper in Zygon, you're thinking, who cares? And I said, I got this great paper in Zygon, and the Australian government is censoring it. Your interest in what I'm selling is now increased. And then message repetition. Message repetition is a bit of a tricky one, but it tends to work. In any case, look, this is some of my, see, I am an expert. Numbers. Lots of numbers. All you need to know from this, just summing it up, is that when I looked at anti-evolutionist mass media in contrast with pro-evolutionist mass media, anti-evolutionist mass media tends to use a wider array of persuasive cues and more nuanced use of persuasive cues than are pro-evolutionists, right? So there tends to be a much more nuanced use of persuasive elements. And having analyzed these persuasive techniques, a question that I've now been frequently asked in one form or another has been, what might your research tell us about how we can better advocate for consensus science in the face of science-skeptical and specifically anti-evolutionist influences? And because I get interrogated so often in my day-to-day life, it's a question that I am seeking to answer for myself as well. I get asked about this quite a bit in movie theaters and in day-to-day life. How do we better respond to these sorts of things? And partly I'm asking this because if I'm honest, I've not always answered people opposed to evolution in ways that are particularly profitable or beneficial. So I'm not always haven't been perhaps a polite enough Canadian. Now, in response to this inquiry, I have at most conveyed, and this is in one of my papers, that aspiring to counter Darwin skepticism, those that are trying to aspire to counter Darwin skepticism must acknowledge that anti-evolutionist media tends to harness a broader and more ubiquitous suite of persuasion techniques than does media supportive of evolutionary theory. So all I've said is, look, if you're a pro-evolutionist, you're interested in advocating for evolutionary theory, you should consider how persuasive heuristic cues can be effectively used for the promotion of biological sciences. And I've been reluctant to provide further advice for at least two reasons. The chief of these is that my analysis of evolution wars mass media has intentionally been a non-normative exercise. So that is the goal of my work has been to systematically describe persuasive attributes and conceptualize implications of media influences, but rather than to prescribe what optimal actions should be taken by, let's say, pro-evolutionist stakeholders. The research I have presented so far has also not directly measured effects of media persuasion. So I have also not gone and directly empirically measured what kind of effects these are having, but instead I've just simply reported on persuasive features that interleave anti-evolutionist and pro-evolutionist communications. And the second reason that I've been cautious about saying anything includes ethical considerations of endorsing a persuasion agenda, right? So, we may know that people can be persuaded by appealing to expertise or common values, just because we know that it could be argued that this knowledge does not necessarily justify the use of such techniques. So look, with regard to this, I'll just quickly say that the aims of media persuasion can be both ethically innocuous as well as sinister. So if an organization or government produces mass persuasive media engineered for improving the overall public good, such as combating drunk driving or curbing domestic violence, this may be conceived as a form of prescribed persuasion, which does not necessarily exemplify negative intent or evil tactics. And this is sometimes called public interest communications. but that is still a difficult topic, the ethics of me possibly prescribing a persuasive approach for trying to promote consensus science. But anyway, turning back to the difficulties of shifting from non-normative research to normative ventures, while my work has measured persuasion cue occurrences, it does not empirically test media effects such as heuristics upon selected audiences, though there are a legion of persuasion research and marketing lessons that point to the effectiveness of such persuasion approaches. At the same time, it is possible to look beyond my own analyses to a growing corpus of pro-science intervention research associated with endorsing scientific notions to doubting audiences. So in particular, vaccination hesitancies have received substantial attention because of the prospective influences of anti-vaccination pundits and the immediate public health repercussions associated with immunization refusal. So just the other day, the WHO released a list of the top 10 most global health threats, and they listed vaccine hesitancies on this top 10 list. So studies into offsetting vaccine hesitancies provide valuable insights concerning kind of the optimal methods for brokering positive rather than negative and constructive science communications with skeptical publics. So, and with my own work, this work into vaccine hesitancies also has often considered the oblique sort of peripheral ways that audiences are influenced by persuasive variables. Now, look, to start, anti-evolutionism can't be likened to directly likened to resistance to anthropogenic climate change or opposition to vaccines. Even so, despite having differing science, denial contexts, and cohorts, research addressing other science skepticism, I argue, can still reveal important details about decision-making trends as well as what has assisted other science communications efforts and the rhetoric of health and medicine more specifically. So on this account, by integrating leading science intervention findings with my own research, I think I can get closer to making more operational recommendations. Another thing is that, again, while anti-vaccinationism and Darwin skepticism differ in their goals and in their retinue, their counter-vaccine media exhibits a lot of similar characteristics to those identified in pro-evolutionist communications. So I don't have time to discuss in detail the ways that anti-vaccinationist and Darwin skeptic media are similar in terms of their rhetoric, but in broad strokes, we can see analogous sort of persuasion motifs observed across both anti-vaccination and Darwin skeptic mass media, which I present here. So we see a lot of asking questions, rhetorical questions, social consensus. You know, so many people cannot be wrong about not vaccinating their children, or so many people cannot be wrong about opposing evolution. A lot of contrast principle negativity effect in terms of comparing the apparent data that opposes, let's say, vaccines, or opposes, or ostensibly opposes evolutionary theory with that supports it. Source cues. This is a significant thing in both anti-evolutionist and anti-vaccination materials, where there's this constant focus on the apparent credibility of the speakers. Fear appeals, statistics and technical jargon throughout, and especially highlighting shared values. So look, we are the ones that really care about freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And it's the other side that is trying to choke us out. And in relation to highlighting shared values and fear appeals, there's a lot of what we call conspiratist ideation. You know, there's this big kind of conspiracy academic cabal that is restricting our thought and freedom. So with these resemblances in mind, we're kind of presented with a picture of two different forms of counter-science media exhibiting comparable persuasion attributes and the potential to trigger the contestation of established science. And so then what then, I ask, can we learn from vaccine hesitancy researchers about how to best respond to anti-vaccination influences, bearing in mind the same sort of persuasive attributes as Darwin skeptic mass media? To start, by all accounts, in terms of trying to communicate science to skeptical audiences, trying to frustrate counter-science initiatives and their affiliative attitudes via intensified fact dissemination is unlikely to succeed. All right, so this is the first lesson from anti-vaccination countering research, is that if you just try to increase facts and tell people more about vaccinations and the science behind vaccinations, it's unlikely to do anything positive. So there has been a broad assent that resistance to scientific premises, such as evolutionary theory or vaccines, does not simply occur because of a deficiency of public rationality. Right? And this is many scientists and other academics and science communicators seem to have long accepted that what has been referred to as the information deficit model of science communication, which assumes that people are skeptical of scientific premises because they lack knowledge or scientific literacy. And the deficit model suppositions have traditionally suggested that the solution to erroneous beliefs about science can be found in simply supplying the public with more information, making rather kind of inexplicable science understandable, and giving people the capacity to comprehend scientific fundamentals. And it's kind of been understood or thought that this will result in reciprocative acceptance of scientific ideas. So look, the public is ignorant. If we just increase facts and disseminate more facts about the science, they'll become more rational and they'll pick it up. But when we look at specifically at vaccine resistance or vaccination resistance, increasing people's factual knowledge and testable understanding about vaccines, for instance, often does not translate into elevated levels of confidence in vaccines or improved immunization behaviors. By contrast, trying to correct misinformation, they've done study after study after study, with accepted scientific facts can often be counterproductive, leading to reductions in people's intentions to vaccinate. So you get cases where you actually sit down people that have expressed vaccine hesitancies, you get a medical doctor to come in and say, look, here is how vaccines work, this is why they're safe, and here's all the science, and people actually leave with lower intentions to vaccinate. And you can actually measure the cognizance. So there have been studies where they said, let's measure people's understanding of vaccines. You can actually get increased understandings of how vaccines work, and then a reciprocal fall in intentions to vaccinate. So in actuality, an individual's understanding of data and theory underlining consensus science is frequently not a reliable indicator of the reception of those same scientific premises. So as a result, when it comes to publicly contested science, such as, again, anthropogenic climate change, biological evolution, or vaccinations, trying to change minds through the intensification of fact communiques is unlikely to produce appreciable results. And so, again, there's been studies where researchers have asked about people's understandings of science, and both, let's say, people that are supportive of anthropogenic climate change, people that are opposed to anthropogenic climate change, have equal levels of understanding. So it's not the understanding that's the problem. In fact, with climate change, sometimes people that are opposed to climate change can actually recite the theory behind climate change better than those that are for climate change. And this is because people are liable to make decisions not only on the basis of data and fact claims, but also in relation to persuasive sociocultural influences that are allied to their identity, associations, and their values, and their social cultural interactions. And it's been found that vaccination beliefs and behaviors are driven by an assortment of psychological, socio-political, and cultural considerations in combination with individuals' awareness of data or measures of scientific understanding. So be that as it may, if increasing data dissemination and science comprehension doesn't really impact vaccination decisions, what approaches to altering vaccination perceptions and behaviors are efficacious for improving immunization acceptance? Are there any pragmatic lessons for research into increasing vaccination uptakes that might be applied or adapted for other counter-science contexts, such as skepticism towards evolutionary theory? So as things stand, again, attempts to modify vaccine beliefs and behaviors provide the immediate lesson that altering people's beliefs and behaviors about contested science seems exceptionally difficult. So not only do facts not work, everything else that's been trialed, much of what has been trialed doesn't seem to work. So most attempts at altering the underlying attitudes and guiding behavior, so around vaccines, for instance, have proven ineffectual, limited in outcomes, or even disadvantageous. So they actually lead to people being less inclined to be vaccinated. and they're frequently designed around sparse amounts of empirical verification. So in reality, there have been few successful evidence-based communication strategies that have positively influenced vaccine beliefs and mitigated opposition to vaccinations. So that's on that positive note. On that positive note, there are some strategies that have demonstrated better results than others. So of the strategies trialed for improving vaccine uptakes, for instance, those that have met with the greatest success and empirical substantiation involve more direct behavioral interventions and delivering improved access to vaccines. So these include providing monetary or non-monetary incentives for vaccinating, imposing penalties, which is what's happened in Australia, for not vaccinating, providing on-site vaccination drives at so coming right to people's places of work, reducing logistical and economic barriers, inhibiting people from getting vaccinated. So that's just, it involves subsidizing travel, for instance, or reducing the cost of getting immunized. Along with that, automatically setting vaccination appointments as the default option for individuals at their local clinic improves vaccination coverage. So such an approach is grounded in the notion of what's called choice architecture or nudging, which includes non-compulsory influences that do not necessarily restrict choices, but instead subtly alter the ways in which the choices are presented. So if you make something opt out, so you're automatically enrolled to get vaccinated by your local doctor, more people just go because it takes too much work to opt out. So if they're automatically opted in and they have to call the doctor and say, oh, I'm not going to come, they're more likely to just go than the other option where you have to opt in to get vaccinated. And so the choice is still there, but the choices are the same. It's just the way that the choices is structured alters people's behavior. Now, look, while these programs may be effective in rallying vaccination uptake, porting them over to Darwin skeptic context is not necessarily straightforward. You can't get enrolled to receive doses of evolutionary theory in an opt-out kind of strategy at your local medical practitioner. So, but that being said, increasing access, choice construction, and behavior modification interventions have demonstrated some of the most operative results in vaccination scenarios. So therefore, I think questions ought to be asked about whether increasing access to pro-evolutionist information or providing incentives or even experimenting with nudging can somehow be used for the advocacy of evolutionary theory in communities expressing science skepticism. Now, along with analysis of behavioral interventions, improving access to vaccines and choice design, numerous studies have identified that healthcare provider recommendations are frequently the key factor in increasing vaccination rates. So, in fact, of all the determinants at play in vaccination choices, one of the strongest predictors of an individual's assent to vaccines is whether their general practitioner delivered positive vaccine advocacy and advice in one-to-one appointment settings. So that was the largest predictor of whether a person got vaccinated or not, is if their doctor said, look, are you vaccinated? This is why I think you should get vaccinated. And they had one-on-one interactive discussions. Crucially, that observation, I think, does have upshots readily translatable to the evolution skepticism and notions of messenger credibility. So though doctor-patient relationships are not wholly reflected in religious leader and congregant or participant or devotee interactions, a local cleric's positive recommendations on evolution, I think, correspondingly serve as a vital influence on a person's receipt of scientific ideas. So that's to say, people unsure about the science of vaccines frequently report that, aside from online searches, so it's actually they go to the internet first, and then they'll ask their doctor. So aside from online searches, their first trusted expert source of information is their local healthcare practitioner. And I think it seems safe to opine that for questions of a religious nature, adherents would likewise turn to the authoritative guidance of their own theological caregivers, taking cues from the religious leaders' perceived expertise on such matters as evolutionary theory. So I venture that, by and large, just as the doctor recommendations are strongly correlated with patient vaccine receipts, so too religious leaders' discourse on evolution would be highly predictive of the views held by congregants with whom the leader has discussed the topic. So a corollary is that if you are a religious mentor supportive of biological evolution's veracity, or you know of such leaders in your midst, face-to-face endorsements from religious protagonists could serve as one of the most effectual ingredients in garnering science acceptance. At the same time, these experts should affirm cultural values. So this is not just religious leaders, but anyone that's trying to promote scientific ideas should affirm cultural values instead of attacking them, and science authorities ought to highlight culturally validating science communications. Additionally, to best avoid values-related polarization, it has been suggested that science communicators employ what's called pluralistic advocacy, and that involves featuring representatives from numerous worldview positions. So look, essentially when science advocacy is delivered by experts from a range of socio-political backgrounds, culturally cognitive polarization tends to diminish because the publicly contested science is no longer associated with any one messenger's group affiliation. So, you know, you can get sort of studies where someone says, look, I want to teach you guys about anthropogenic climate change and why it's a real thing, and I am a Democrat. And as soon as that person says that, everyone in the room who does not identify with being a Democrat then judges that person's credibility as being poor, even though that person has scientific credibility, maybe has prestigious degrees. As soon as that person demonstrates socio-cultural values that differ from them, it tends to nullify the expertise that person has. So what one finding is you identify with those people's values, or you present a plurality of views. So you don't just have one person talking about anthropogenic climate change who's a Democrat, you have someone who's a Republican. And if you have two people, then all of a sudden the audience says, oh, more than one type of person can have this view, and it tends to reduce social cognitive polarization. So science advocacy and advocates bearing connections to cultural meanings will be responded to according to those cultural attributes, rather than just the scientific facts being communicated. And so scientists seem to think we can just, often seem to assume, or science communicators seem to assume that we can just increase fact dissemination, but you will be judged not just by the facts, but by the cultural associations that you have as a communicator. So in appreciating that, I say it would be rather inane to assume that, let's say, religious anti-evolutionists might be persuaded to accept evolutionary theory if the biological premise is represented as being fundamentally atheist in nature, and if the advocates themselves are vehemently opposed to any and all religion. Right? You're not, people of a religious leaning will just not accept the theory because it'll be assumed that then evolution is atheistic. In such circumstances, the acceptance of evolution's empirical facts would hinge upon the cultural values thought to be linked with atheism, such that the acceptance of and rejection of polarization would likely splinter between atheists and non-atheists accordingly, regardless of scientific facts. So, aggressively challenging an audience's belief system or central ideologies will only amplify polarization around evolutionary theory or other science, consensus science topics such as vaccinations or anthropogenic climate change. So additionally, some other recommendations include improving the readability. So this is something that's come out with vaccine studies, that pro-vaccine media tends to be much more complex and less readable to general audiences, while anti-vax materials tend to be significantly more readable and salient. Other recommendations including tailoring communications to specific audiences. If you know who you're talking to, then adjust your message to those audiences, which is of course a tried and true marketing adage of know your audience. And another one is targeting fence sitters. So in anti-vax research, they found that targeting ardent and strident anti-vaxxers or anti-vaxxer pundits is completely unsuccessful. And it's also, the majority of the population tends not to be ardent anti-vaxxers, for instance. They tend to be hesitant. And it's much better to target people that are undecided or still deciding rather than those that are completely decided. So look, taking these initial ideas into account for prescriptive ends, as well as some other ideas that I'm going to mention quickly, I codified these recommendations, translating them into the context of promoting evolutionary theory, and componentized the science communication strategies into three broad categories, which I describe as general guiding principles, proximate interventions, and auxiliary interventions. So general guiding principles, look, discard the information deficit model, account for cultural cognition. Think about the cultural values that people have, enlist local religious leaders, improve the readability of science-endorsing materials, again, tailor communications to specific audience, target fence-sitters, affirm the autonomy of choice. Always affirm people's ability and their intellect and their intelligence to make their own decisions and their own intellectual freedoms, respect the audience, and this is an interesting one, avoid the familiarity backfire effect. So interestingly enough, they found that when pro-science communicators say, look, you've heard this myth about vaccines, that vaccines cause autism, that MMR causes autism. Here is the truth. Down the line, no one remembers the truth, and they only remember the myth, because the myth was more salient. They've heard the myth before. So in repeating the myth, in trying to overthrow it, you're actually making it more salient in people's minds. And some of the research around this is a bit dodgy. But essentially, the idea is that you should try to avoid repeating science-skeptical myths, because people already know those myths, and by repeating them, they'll remember that myth down the road rather than your opposition to it. But they found that providing warnings before mentioning myths helps. So along with these general guiding principles are proximate interventions, and they include the more direct behavior modification kind of face-to-face techniques. So try nudging, employ incentives where possible, improve people's access to information. Just make it easier for people to get information, and then one-on-one face-to-face mediation. And then we have auxiliary interventions. And these, along with kind of direct strategies, there still remains a need to enhance the ways in which evolution is being communicated, not only in one-to-one settings, but also in persuasive media. So, and mass communications are certainly, almost certainly less operative than proximate science advocacy methods, but because of the practical limitations of behavior modification and face-to-face mediation techniques, there's still a need for using better media communication techniques, and many of these actually coincide with the persuasive cues that I've described throughout my own research. So looking at those peripheral cues. And importantly, these same techniques can also be used to optimize one-on-one interventions, as well as more mass communication. So we get source cues, identify your messenger credibility, social consensus, presumptive announcements, messenger repetition and reminders tend to be very effective. Statistics and technical jargon. So this is the thing, make it more readable, but all the research into vaccines says, but you should still put in some statistics and technical jargon to demonstrate that, look, you're an expert. I say cautious use of the contrast principle negativity effect. Scarcity principle, identify when freedom of information is being restricted or ideas are being censored, because that tends to be quite interesting. And employ narratives. So we need to become better storytellers. So for instance, in the anti-vaccination community, narratives are a primary means of communication. So in many respects, this list of auxiliary interventions reflects several of the persuasive devices that are already being used to a much greater degree by a myriad of science skeptic pundits around the globe. So you can choose your science skepticism. You'll see many of these techniques already being used, and I'll end here. So it's on that note that I return to the question regarding what my own research tells us about how to better advocate for consensus science in view of anti-evolutionist influences. And since counter-science commentators are already interfacing with vast global audiences via such instrumental persuasive devices, it seems incumbent upon science communicators to refine the use of the same sorts of strategies in the interest of positively and constructively improving the public reception of things like evolutionary theory. Because when it comes down to how people make decisions about publicly contested science, it's often the case that the way science communications are delivered is as important as their factual bases. Thank you.
No, afterwards. Yeah. It's my turn. No, I probably want 5 more. Hey, you got me on? Well, I learned something new about science today. I found out I'm half banana. But I think in my case it's from mostly from the neck up. Also, you don't have to worry about me building a consensus, because as soon as I get anybody to agree with me, I got to find a new argument. You got it, man? All right, ready? Up, down. It's looking a little dark there. What? I'll warm it up. I'll warm it up. No. One thing about the Tom's talk is louder. One thing about Tom's talk there, a lot of those issues play out in a lot of different arenas. I know there's a lot of politic discourse in contemporary times, but as far as science goes, I know there's a lot of overlap with some of those issues in the climate change debate. I know Naomi Oreskes at Harvard does a lot of work with that, negotiating how these things play out in public discourse. And I know, there's some people here working with ancient cosmology and its interpretation and presentation, and a lot of these kind of tactics also come into the flat Earth debates. So, these things can be considered in many ways. All right, so that's me, or my name. I got a history degree here at the University of Florida. I kind of tripped into it. I was hanging out at Christian lunch, and they stopped giving me free lunch, so I went to take some courses. Actually, I'm a little bit like Ravi. I went to, well, in some ways, I went to school later. I was 42, but I was determined to act like 12 while I was in school. So I don't know if it's exactly this. All right, so I got to give a presentation. Those are my extra 5 minutes. All right, so Foundations of the Bhaktivedanta Institute, documents from Richard L. Thompson Archives. I'm co-director of this project. It's a small project. A lot of the folks here are working with us on it. Bob's the other co-director, because you need at least one adult on any project. Prishni's been involved. Udi here, technical, has been involved with the web design. Chris Beadle has been involved. We worked through we got a lot of papers from Dinia, Richard's husband, wife. Richard was her husband, as far as I understand gender relations. Richard was, Richard was one of the founding members of the Bhaktivedanta Institute. It was established in the 70s, and he collected every dang piece of paper we found. So many documents. He was involved from the earliest days, and he had papers of everything. Along with his own prolific work, we found so much material. So we went through, we organized it. We had cases and cases and cases of papers. Some of it we shipped to India, to the Bhaktivedanta Research Institute, I think it is. They work with the TOVP there. I was just there. Is that it? What do I got? Research Center. Research Center. I was just there visiting. They work with the TOVP and other projects, and they do a lot of ancient text scanning, but they kept some of this old research that wasn't directly related to Richard's work. All right, so we organized it, digitized it. We got a website up there, simple address, RLT Archives, or sadhapur.com if you're familiar with this devotional name. This is a snap of the site. For our purpose, so I get a lot of so many things. Get a lot of scientific papers, a lot of essays for the Congregational magazine, I guess for the Krishna organization, cosmography work, cosmology is books. So it's a place to keep his prolific work as an active part of the discourse. For our purposes, we'll focus on Bhaktivedanta Institute, and he kept a lot of historical documents. And this would, okay, so we'll get to that. This is some of his work, just to briefly. He was a mathematician. His dissertation in the early 70s was selected by the American Mathematical Society for its exceptional potential, his research, quality of research. It was published by them. His dissertation advisor was Frank Spitzer, a well-established mathematician at Cornell. and he somehow snuck. He was involved with the Christians at that point. He snuck this into this publication by the Mathematical Institute. It's not your standard mathematical equation, but it worked for them. He also did some textbooks. This is brief. He did a lot of collaborations with Narendra S. Goel. He was a Sunni at the time, and elsewhere later did some research for NASA, funded for them other research as well. So he has peer-reviewed scientific papers, did professional work, did a lot of stuff that passed the peer review of this congregational type magazine for outreach. This was a cover article of some of his work in cosmology, ancient cosmology. So he was an active fella in the field. And we're going to focus on Bhaktivedanta Institute. This is in the 70s. Here he is with Bhakti-Damodar, who's really a central figure here. We'll talk briefly about him. I have names and stuff. But there'll be more. I know there'll be 2 speakers tomorrow. I have names written down. Rajendra Swami and Rajapati Swami will be talking more at length about Bhakti-Damodar tomorrow. T.D. Singh. Here's Thompson. This is Prabhupada. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. He brought this tradition, long ancient tradition with roots in the South Asian context, for euphemistic language there. Brought it and established it in a Western context. Here's Rupa Nuga, his devotional name, Ravi. He was a manager of this project early on. And Michael Marchetti, I believe it's pronounced. He still remains active. He's based in New Jersey. And here, one of their early projects, just to bring it home here a little bit, was this conference we'll talk about, Life Comes from Life Conference in Vadhavan, 77, about 40 years ago. T.D. Singh, Thompson, the web, he's active in Russia-Ukraine area. We'll see a film from him, I think tomorrow, the next day, Marchetti again. And this fellow here, Robert Cohen, also known as Bob Cohen. Yeah, I think he got reinitiated. Okay, so here's just to some of the backdrop. So Prabhupada brought this tradition to the West, and he was, before he came here and hung out with the Westerners in the West, he was doing his own outreach. This is his first book. It was on the topic, he called it Easy Journey to Other Planets, but it was I would say, I describe it as I was going to say riffing, but he's sort of, in the news, this is 60s, late 50s, the space race is on. He was particularly riffing off a recent discovery of a particle called antimatter, a type of energy, and he was playing with it in some BTG essays in his own little journal he was publishing and distributing, riffing on that to start to talk about the spiritual energy as being an alternate energy to material energy. So he's playing with that. Oh, can I walk with it? I'm fidgety. Okay, so he was riffing on that. I'm going to use the slang. And then he got a response from a scientist, a well-established scientist at Gujarat University, who also, being from India, was very familiar with Vedantic literature. I'll use that language. And so based on that exchange, they had numerous letters. Prabhupada got inspired. This was his first published book, to write this book, this sort of interaction with scientific dialogue and public discourse. And he dedicated this book to the scientists of the world with the blessings of his own spiritual master, which from a Vaishnava perspective is probably about as good as it's going to get if a guru gives you the blessings of his own guru in turn. So he he's keeping it positive here. All right, so this is a little example from their exchange that Prabhupada published at the beginning of this book. And this scientist, one of the things he's pointing out here is in one sense you're co-opting this term antimatter and sort of extrapolating to have a discussion about spiritual energy, but actually the scientists themselves are using the term antimatter in a different context. They're still thinking of it as an alternate form of the material energy. Perhaps a better word he will say here is anti-material. It's in here someplace. Antimatter is the opposite kind. It's not spirit. Spirit, matter comprehends, blah, blah, blah. Antimatter can do none of these things. Matter and antimatter can't comprehend. Your analysis is therefore strictly correct if applied to anti-material. Gets into some Vedic technical language. So he's in one sense correcting or fine-tuning the discourse. And Prabhupada here is fine with it. For one thing, he's publishing this, and then he's saying, here's my pointer. The subject matter, well, one thing is I'm very much encouraged by, to go through the contents of your, there's a lot of valuable information there. The subject matter in my article under reference authorized, and this is how he's qualifying his own authority. It's authorized as far as it refers to the conclusions of the Gita. He's claiming his authority, he's speaking about the Gita, and he's engaging these other concepts, and that context is how I'm reading it. I may also inform you that my concept of antimatter is exactly what you call antimaterial. Technically, it may be that I have not expressed the exact word used by the physicists, but I've tried to explain the word antimatter and light in the sense that you say is antimaterial. So, he's not here trying to redefine the discipline of physics and project his expectations on them. He's willing to engage. And this isn't just him. Well, this wasn't, when the BBT published this work in English, this is in English too, but in America, the movement was started in the 70s. They didn't include this, I guess, because it's not that relevant. Anyways, it wasn't included, but this is valuable. It's easy to get. We have it on the website. It's many places online. Thompson had one of the original books. But this wasn't a mysterious thing. In Prabhupada's official biography by ISKCON and the BBT, published in 1980, there's a discussion there that Bhaktivedanta Swami was well aware that scientists were not speaking of anti-material in the sense of eternal or spiritual, but he thought of using their scientific terms to capture the interest of the scientific-minded people. So that was his attitude to engage in this discourse, at least within the context of this text. So one reason I'm going on and on about this, because there was a recent academic critique of Prabhupada's relation and ISKCON's relation to science, and one thing that scholar was going on about is how Prabhupada was trying to prove that scientific discoveries gave credence and proof to the spiritual world. And that's an argument, but it doesn't appear that's what he's doing here in the original text, nor is it what the BBT publication, that's the authorized, they weren't considering it that way either, so there could be more complexity here. All right, that image, well, it's good enough. Okay, now we're up into the 70s. There's a movement here of young Western disciples. Prabhupada is working with them. They have an international society already by this time, temples around the world. He's starting to attract a few people with more advanced educational training, and most notable among them is Bhakti Swarup Damodar, at the time called Swarup Damodar. He was from India, as you might guess, from Manipur, grew up in a Vaishnava family, is my understanding. You'll hear a more authoritative take on this tomorrow. So very comfortable with this tradition. He grew up swimming in it. And then he was in America finishing up his PhD in biochemistry, I think at UC Irving. So he's very well trained in the scientific disciplines as well, very familiar with them as well. So he's coming. 1970, he joined full-time, so there's some-ish. And immediately Prabhupada took to him. They're going on morning walks. This is in California, I assume Venice Beach or close by. And actually, and the topic of science, the exchange came up naturally. Excuse me. Bhakti Swarup Damodar, you see a picture here, has a recorder with him. And this is a side note. Actually, these are some of the earliest morning walk recordings. 72, you go to, they're all from LA with Bhakti Swarup Damodar mostly. And 73, these recordings would end up becoming a basis for a book, a famous book within this context called Life Comes from Life. And I've heard accounts that actually at that point on, people started to bring the recorder out regularly. They'd started recording morning walks regularly. But it was really, that too, as a side, it was issued by Bhakti Swarup Damodar as Discourse. But he's with people who have some background in these topics. He can bring it up to another level, perhaps. His other disciples, they're not, foolish. That many of them are also college educated. They would also engage in these discourses. I did a paper on this. Where we're going with this is these discourses were recorded. We have the transcripts, are widely available for the last 30 years. But this particular book is not accurate historical account. It's more of a dramatization. And I'm sympathetic, but it is what it is. So let's look at this a little bit just to have perhaps a better sense of what this discourse was and how it's been received and understood. So these recordings would be going to LA at the time. They had a little thing going on called Golden Avatar Studios. They collect these tapes as a central repository, copy them, and send them out for a subscription service. This was an ad in that Back to Godhead magazine. So these recordings with Bhakti Swarup Damodar went out. Some of them from '73. And you know, it was interesting. Devotees responded. These devotees in Germany, they're starting. The first books they were publishing was around this time in German. So they have a crew there working on German translations. They heard these tapes. They liked them. Prabhupada was asked, "Can we do some of these dialogues as a book?" Prabhupada said yes. And it turned '74. The first edition of this book was in German, called That. And we'll move on. I'm still working on English. So at the time, the tape ministry wasn't that well organized yet, not till the late '70s when they start to work on the biography project under the BBT steering. And they started to really systematize at that point. Ranjit, is he here, did a paper on that. It was published in, it was published in ISKCON Studies, something. All right, so the English edition was published. They got a manuscript as a basis, and what they got was a translation of the German edition back into English. It appears. And this is the evidence. So here was the German edition. This is the second chapter, 19th April 1973. They misspelled the name of the park because they don't live in Los Angeles, anywhere close. Their first sentence here is, well, I can detect that has something to do with archaeologists. And here's this English version. We see that here, archaeology. You know, the English editors decided maybe not, that's a good start. Here's another thing here. Prabhupada's talking something about these terms here from the Gita, Sattva, Raja, and Tama, goodness, passion, ignorance. And here we see that here. Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. And here they're going to start. The English, this is a working manuscript. I'm sure there was a number. And here we see they're going to start there. Here's the English edition. All right, very good. Modern technology. I got one. And here we see the English edition starts with that. So it's following the German edition. And here what we have is, you know, I had a timer in my iPhone and I didn't even put it on. But at any rate, it doesn't read the same. Maybe this, under my superintendence, it has some correspondence. The material energy is all something here working everywhere. But there's nothing else here that seems to match. This is a transcript of the recorded conversation. It doesn't appear to match. You have a hard time finding the exact correspondence. That suggests that these German devotees, perhaps listening to tapes, get inspired, and put something together. It's not a disciplined treatment, perhaps, is one way to look at it. Here's something that they put in the published version. According to Darwin, Darwin's father is a monkey, and then, you know, apparently that got a guffaw. He has theorized foolishly, so it's a little provocative, but yeah, that's cool. Okay, you know, monkeys. He's a monkey, man. The guy's a monkey. But here, we don't even see that anywhere here. I don't find it here. I haven't yet found it in the rest of the transcript. So there's a little bit of creative liberties going on, and this was a remains an influential book. I think it's useful for certain things, but it's not useful as a historical accurate account. We do have accurate accounts. The archives have put out a digital encyclopedia of all the materials they have. The transcripts included since the early 90s. Online, you can get it now of any source. This would be a section on the morning walks from '73. Here it would be. You click on that. That's the date. And here you get the archival transcript with the recording. You can check yourself. So these things have been available for a good 25, 30 years. There's no conspiracy here. But for scholarly purposes, I highly recommend checking some of these accounts with the, archives. The archives on the BI. So the BI, these are early morning walks, a source of inspiration. Bhakti Swarup Damodar is a real central figure. Here he is again. They're with Prabhupada now, 76, Washington, D.C. Prabhupada's last major tour, I think it was his last tour of the United States. Here's Richard Thompson. Rupanuga, Richard Corrins, and Marchetti, a few of the central characters. With Prabhupada, 76, Washington, D.C., they were all gathering there with Prabhupada, getting instructions, discourse, and so on. And these are recorded as well. Here's another picture early on from about this period. I think it could have been a year later. They're going over some of the material they're publishing. This would be the editorial board. Singh, Swarup Damodar. Here's William Deadweiler. I think he's here someplace. He's still extant, as well as Bob. Richard Thompson, etc. These people are still active, some of them. Here's an excerpt from these conversations, just to give you some sense of complexity here, or broadening it. Here's a question from Bhaktivedanta. This is, he's instructing his science disciples. So what's the problem here? The scientists, we're not claiming you're all nonsense, that you're good men, but you should know your limits. So Swarup Damodar is proposing that. Prabhupada seems to be agreeing. You should not, so to the science, you should not be so proud falsely. That is our point. And what falsely proud about what? And mislead others that there's no God. A very basic theistic argument. This is going to be bad time-wise, but I appreciate it. Because you've accepted as authority that there is no God, they will accept it. The scientists, atheistic evangelicalizing in the name of science, hiding behind professional science, a reputation to evangelize a metaphysical proposition. So they will accept it based on the reputation when an atheist hides behind a science. Then our back to movement will stop, so therefore we must challenge this nonsense, and this nonsense is that there's no God. It is a fight because and here he says it plainly, because you say there is no God, we say you are all nonsense. So there's another scholar who would argue, from what I can recollect, that Prabhupada has essentialized all science as nonsense and rascals, but the context is in this very basic theistic, atheistic debate that often hides behind the religion and science discourse. And here Prabhupada saying, I think Isaac Newton, says, we must challenge. We must say it. You are challenging, we must challenge you back. But you accept God, then we have nothing to complain about. We're good. And then here, I think Sir Isaac Newton said like that, quote, the vast knowledge we have simply gathered, a few grains of sand on the beach of knowledge, something like that. That is good. So, interesting. There's another, this is from Arindra Swarup, the same conversation for that time period. They may say, we're scientists, we're limited, we're faulty, this and that, you can criticize, but what do you got that's better? So Prabhupada responds, well, I may not have something, I may not show, but I'll give you an example. You've manufactured a 747, you use that a lot, that was the hot technology, and God has manufactured a mosquito, so you do that. So Prabhupada would say, sometimes he'd use planets. God's planets. So I see. I'm a layman. I see there's another better manufacturer than you. I may be a layman, but I can see that you cannot do it. So this is an argument. And then I'll speed it up exponentially after this. So you take your credit as much as you've done, but if you want to take the place of God, then we must, for laughs, slap you left and right. That is our business. That is our business, because we cannot give you credit better than God. There is nobody equal to God, nobody better than God. That is our preaching. As soon as you admit that we are under God, then we have no quarrel. You admit it, then we have no quarrel. You admit that, yes, we are under God, then we have friends. My point here is his basic issue with the scientists is this atheistic preaching that has gone on in this discourse. I'm going to really skim it up. I know, but I was only given 20 minutes to begin with. As opposed to, but I'll get it done real quick, very quick. I'm not letting go of this sucker, man. I tell you. All right, so this is something you'll have to explore on your own, or I'm not getting dinner. We have a lot of historical documents. You go to the website; they're all listed here. We published a book. It's available over there. You can skim through these documents of the first conference that these devotees were working on. Here's some more. This is some of the early materials that were produced during the 70s, these monographs, other materials. Copies of these are all up on the website. Some of this is in that book, the facsimile, for your coffee table where you served decaffeinated coffee. Other documents are the original charter. This is online. Here was for this first conference. There was a brief outline, they're brainstorming for a mission for the conference, many, many documents. This was a draft of some of these early books, one of the monographs, editorial board, all these documents. These are all foundational documents of the Bhaktivedanta Institute. You can look at it, get a sense of what these people were thinking, how they were arguing, debating, considering their mission, what they're doing. Here's a cool one. They didn't have internet back in the 70s. I can remember that far back. But they had, produced a brochure. They mailed out to scientists. This was the brochure inviting scientists to the conference, describes the conference, their topics. Very interesting. Probably Sadhguru had the last one. Here's the people who came there, a very good selection of scholars, both from inside and outside the movement, and more. Okay, I got, here's another one. Here's cute. There's another picture of Bob. Okay, and more. How can you refuse me that? And okay, so we got more. Here's the original mission statement, published, and I think I'm out of rope, man. I'm done. Yeah. We have copies of gifts as door prizes of this book tomorrow, the contemporary edition. All right, I got to get the hell out of here. I'm getting in trouble. Huh?
Actually, you're next. Come on on. Oliver will continue next. We're going to ask all the remaining speakers to keep it as brief as possible so people don't keel over, but there's important things to say. Appreciate the talk, even though I cut him off, on the archives you did. It's very important. I mentioned before that our local Bhaktivedanta Institute here was built on the shoulders of Richard Thompson, and Richard Thompson's work, as you see, was built on the shoulders of Thotham Singh, also known as Swarup Damodar Maharaj, and it was built on his shoulders, who was the original founder of our institute. And tomorrow morning we're going to have a very, very interesting history that I think you'll find relevant. With that, we'll turn it over to Oliver. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Bob and Prishni, for inviting me here today to, is that better? Okay. To talk about the article that titled Vaishnavism, Antievolutionism and Ambiguities, Revisiting ISKCON's Darwin Skepticism, that Tom, my PhD supervisor, and I had published in the Science Religion journal Zygon last year. So when I first started to research this topic, I was under the impression that ISKCON is quite uniformly opposed to evolutionary theory. And this assumption was very strongly confirmed in the small amount of academic literature on ISKCON-Evolution discourse. But when I looked more closely, I noticed that scholars hadn't yet considered some of ISKCON's most recent publications, or even aspects of ISKCON's founder, Prabhupada's work. In these texts, much of what I observed still pointed to conflict, but I also found that some ISKCON authors had made cautious, tentative attempts to accommodate evolutionary science. And surprisingly, I even found evidence of this in the material by Prabhupada, who's usually depicted as fiercely opposed to evolution. So in our article, we argue that these layers of complexity actually problematize terms like Vedic creationism and anti-evolutionism, which are commonly attributed to ISKCON as a whole. So only a few scholars have explored ISKCON's quite extensive engagement with science, and so far they've focused especially on conflict. In the 90s, Mikhail Rothstein compared science-religion discourse in ISKCON and Transcendental Meditation, and argued that ISKCON views science as a fundamentally malevolent system that leads away from the religious truth, while emphasizing its own teachings at the exclusion of all foreign concepts and social systems. Though Rothstein himself saw common ground between ISKCON beliefs and evolutionary theory, he concluded that ISKCON has by no means tried to make use of these structural resemblances. In a 2002 article, C. Mackenzie Brown considered the parallels between Christian creationism and ISKCON's often screamingly explicit anti-evolutionism, arguing that both groups dismiss evolutionary science as an atheistic religion and draw upon supposedly anomalous fossils in order to validate religious conceptions of biological history. On Prabhupada, Brown says that he remained inexorably opposed to Darwinian evolution and was convinced that any theory of organic evolution undermined or even contradicted the notion that the universe and all its parts, including all species of life, were created by Krishna. And more recently, in a comparative study of 3 American new religions, Benjamin Zeller observed that ISKCON throughout the 60s and 70s adopted a strongly anti-science position, openly rejecting Western science and calling for its replacement with an idealized Vedic science. Several of ISKCON's recent publications actually epitomize the anti-evolutionism that these scholars have described. 2 examples are the 2009 book, Rethinking Darwin, A Vedic Study of Darwinism and Intelligent Design, by the devotee Leif A. Jensen, who's also the chairman of the Danish Society of Intelligent Design, and the 2010 book, Nature's IQ, Extraordinary Animal Behaviors That Defy Evolution, by the Hungarian devotees Balázs Honyansky and István Tazi. Interestingly, both of these books draw extensively from anti-evolutionists from outside of ISKCON, with Rethinking Darwin including entire chapters by the leading intelligent design theorists Michael Behe, William Dembski, and Jonathan Wells. By dovetailing these intelligent design arguments with ISKCON's own teachings, Jensen constructs what he describes as an alternative paradigm derived from the Vedic literature, and Honyansky and Tazi state categorically that in the Vedic view, evolution in the way people understand it today never took place. Some more examples can be found in a 2009 edition of Back to Godhead, where the well-respected devotee scholar Urmila Devidasi, who's also written a guidebook for education in ISKCON, published an article titled Education and Evolution, a look at the influence of evolutionary theory in modern education. Also reflecting the work of non-ISKCON anti-evolutionists, she argues that the mechanistic processes of evolution diminish human value and meaning and lead to an array of harmful consequences like materialism, atheism, and competition for resources. She concludes that evolutionary theory is opposed to the mode of goodness and is actually a dangerous idea to teach to young, impressionable students. In the same edition of Back to Godhead, an article titled Hare Krishna Statement on ISKCON's 200th Anniversary appeared with an authorization from ISKCON's Governing Body Commission. This official statement once again echoed arguments from prominent intelligent design theorists, and after blaming Darwinism for economic, environmental, and food crises, called for the leaders of society to promote divine creation as a justified and rational alternative to evolutionary theory. But among these oppositional responses, some ISKCON authors have also made cautious attempts to identify common ground between Vaishnava theology and evolutionary theory. One example is the 2005 book Life and Spiritual Evolution by Bhaktisvarup Damodara Swami, which suggests that all life forms exist in a subtle state, either manifested or unmanifested within a cosmic plan, and appear on Earth at various stages in order to fulfill the physical requirements of souls. He rejects the notion of purely random genetic mutations, but doesn't seem to oppose the evolutionary mechanism itself. In fact, he suggests that the spiritual paradigm of Vedanta could integrate the Darwinian paradigm, provided that the concept of a soul is still accepted. Another example is found in the work of Chaitanya Charandas, whose 2017 podcast on his website, The Spiritual Scientist, discusses ISKCON theology in relation to 3 different definitions of evolution: adaptation and variation within species, the transmutation of species, and an all-explaining ideology that can be applied to every facet of life. For Chaitanya Charan, the first definition is entirely compatible with ISKCON's sacred scriptures, because he says it's been known since Vedic times that material nature is constantly changing. He expresses some doubt about whether the second definition, transmutation, has been fully proven, but says he's willing to accept this notion if the evidence is there, and he doesn't see any contradiction between transmutation and Vaishnava theology. In this regard, he cites Krishna's statement in the Bhagavad Gita, "Under my supervision, material nature undergoes various transformations." And in reference to the Bhagavad Purana, he adds that evolution is talking about what happened on earth, and the Bhagavatam is talking about a completely different level of existence. That's why they need not contradict. He says, by Krishna's arrangement, the species appeared at various places, and then on earth they could have come by the mechanism of evolution. Though Chaitanya Charan considers the first two definitions unproblematic, he states that the third definition, evolution as a universal ideology, is entirely incompatible with Vaishnava theology. Not only does this concept threaten belief in God, he says, but it's also empirically and logically unsubstantiated. Interestingly, he points out that Prabhupada was only ever really presented with this ideological atheistic definition, and this invites one to wonder, had Prabhupada been more exposed to neutral accounts of evolution, if he may have actually agreed with Chaitanya Charan's overall conclusion that ISKCON does not have to be at war with evolution. So these examples, which are only a sample of recent ISKCON-Evolution publications, seem to indicate that ISKCON is not a homogeneously anti-evolutionist movement, despite some authors, both inside and outside of the movement, continuing to present it as such. But now, in the last few minutes, I'd like to consider how these variegated perceptions compare with those of ISKCON's founder. So in Prabhupada's published works, references to Darwinian evolution are actually quite few and far between, but there's still some fairly consistent themes. For example, in Easy Journey to Other Planets, in the third canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, he claims that Darwin's theory is not a new idea because Vaishnava scriptures have already described how the living entities in different forms evolve one after another. In the fourth canto of the Bhagavatam, he outlines an evolutionary process with Krishna developing different types of bodies and impregnating material energy with souls, and then he concludes that Darwin's theory is incomplete because there's no acceptance of the living entity as spirit soul. Later in the fourth canto, he claims that evolutionary scientists can't explain how the gross body is changing because such changes are connected to the activities of the subtle body, which are produced by the soul and are guided by the supersoul. In The Science of Self-Realization, he says that human life is attained after many millions of years of evolution, and life began with the aquatics, for we can understand from the Vedic literature that at the beginning of creation the entire planet was merged in water. And in the transcripts that were later developed into Life Comes from Life, alongside some more provocative statements, Prabhupada would often adopt a fairly moderate approach. For example, to the notion that life emerged from chemicals, he simply questioned where from those chemicals developed, and then answered that the explanation is Krishna. So in each of these examples, it seems that Prabhupada's main concern was not whether a process of evolution took place, but whether modern theories actually deny the existence of God and the spirit soul. But paradoxically, Prabhupada would also sometimes claim that all forms of life are simultaneously created. This view, which seems to contradict his other statements, became the crux of a conversation with Shama Sundradas, in which Prabhupada responded to various evolutionary perspectives with arguments for both simultaneous creation and attempts to reconcile his theology with modern science. For example, when Shamasundra described natural selection, Prabhupada replied that natural selection, that law is made by Krishna. On biological mutations, he said, this shows nature is working, but Darwin is unable to explain how nature is working. And regarding chance variation and adaptation, he protested only to the notion of randomness, retorting, there's no such chance. Our question is, who has made these circumstances for the existence of different animals? Behind nature's law, he said, there's a brain, and that brain is God. But repeatedly, Sharma Sundar asked Prabhupada how he could accept these evolutionary notions and simultaneous creation. And Prabhupada responded with an array of creative metaphysical explanations. At one point he argued that all species have always existed, but not necessarily on Earth, but rather in some realm of material nature, and they manifest on Earth at certain points in history according to higher principles. To illustrate this, he said that the form of a lungfish appeared on Earth when a normal fish desired to survive without water. So the species of lungfish already existed in some realm of the Puranic cosmos, but it manifested on Earth in order to accommodate the living entity's desire to adapt to its environment. Many of Prabhupada's statements in this conversation and elsewhere suggest that he probably didn't have a very comprehensive understanding of evolution or a consistent response to it. But for the purpose of our article, what we found noteworthy is that he was willing to try to reconcile evolution with Vaishnava theology when his disciple petitioned him to do so. So, in conclusion, scholars like Brown and Zeller have correctly pinpointed a prevalent Darwin skepticism in ISKCON, and much ISKCON evolution material supports this view. But a small number of prominent ISKCON authors have also produced media that's much more accommodating towards evolutionary theory, and Prabhupada himself often seems more nuanced or ambiguous in his critique of evolution than he's often depicted to be. Though he did fiercely oppose atheism and often claimed that Vaishnava scriptures contain higher or more spiritually complete knowledge than modern science, it seems that his primary concern was not whether evolution actually occurred, but that Krishna is always recognized to be behind the functioning of the natural world. In a way that's somewhat characteristic of his entire Western mission, he seemed willing to entertain a variety of approaches insofar as they facilitated his central theological message that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So overall, these layers of complexity, both past and present, seem to problematize terms like Vedic creationism and Antievolutionism that scholars have so far tended to attribute to ISKCON as a whole. Thank you.
Next and last. Oliver, that was really good. Thank you. A lot of good insights. Last but not least, and then we will just take a couple of questions to any of the speakers, and then we will have our dinner.
So, good evening, everyone. I have the distinction of being the last speaker today and of being the only person between you and dinner. So, I'm going to try my best to keep this short. I don't have a PowerPoint. It's rather old-fashioned. I have a handout, but I grossly underestimated the number of people who would come to the conference. And so I'll pass this back. If we can just have 2 handouts per row, I think we'll get through the whole thing. Unless your row has 2 people, then please use 1. This is not a summary of my talk. It's quotations that I use in my talk, but you do not need to follow along in order to understand, so please don't worry if you can't see a handout. So first of all, I want to say thank you to Bob Cohen and to Dr. Jonathan Banks and to Prishni Sutton for inviting me and for arranging the logistics of the trip. I'm really grateful. I'm here really, I mean, I know many people have said this, but I'm truly here as an outsider because I'm not a scientist, I'm not a historian of science, I'm not a philosopher of science. I come to this meeting from the perspective of theology and religious studies, which is what I teach professionally. And So although I'm not coming at it from the perspective of science, if we conceive of part of our work here as a meeting between science and religion, between spirituality and science, then I think it's important that we look at the subject matter from the perspective of theology as well. So many of our speakers, most of them, have been talking about, well, if we're standing in the realm of science, how do we reach out to spirituality? How do we reach out to religion? My approach is going to be from the opposite direction. Standing in the realm of theology, particularly Chaitanya Vaishnava or Gaudiya Vaishnava theology, the tradition within which Bhaktivedanta Institute is grounded, how do we find space? How do we create space for scientific reflection, empirical observation? So the title of my talk is really a question. Does empirical observation, is there room for empirical observation to influence scriptural testimony? And for those who are familiar with the terminology, the question I'm really asking is a question of pramana. What are the valid means of knowledge that we can get? And the philosophers of the Chaitanya Vaishnava tradition, particularly Jiva Gosvami, the main systematic philosopher of the early tradition in the 16th century, boils down the number of pramanas, or valid sources of knowledge, to 3. Shabda, scriptural testimony; pratyaksha, empirical observation or sensory observation; and anumana, which is logical inference, sometimes reason, but I think inference is technically more correct. So these 3 are described as valid means of knowing things in this world and beyond this world. But as will be familiar to those who know this tradition, Shabda, or revelation, scriptural testimony, I won't get hung up on specific translations here. We can discuss them more individually, but scriptural testimony or revelation is regarded as the one that is really the controlling pramana, so that in his Sarva-samvadini, his appendix to the Sandarbhas, Jiva Goswami says that this one means of Shabda is superior in that it does not depend on any of the others, pratyaksha or anumana, that although the others may assist it as far as they are able, this one independent means of knowing in performing its function is even seen to overrule the others. That a fact established by the one means, Shabda, is irreversible by the others. And finally, that it is most effective in proving facts that the powers of the other means cannot even touch. In sum, later on he says, the 2 other principal means of knowing, inference and or reason and perception, are thus reduced to shadow-like subordinates. This essentially is our problem. Okay, this is not the problem, but the challenge. If Shabda has such an overwhelming rule and control over the other 2, then the use of scientific inquiry, if science is along the lines of what Dr. Banks defined it as today, the use of scientific inquiry can at best be merely to confirm what is written in Scripture, which then makes it perhaps a tool for adding conviction or understanding or marketing, but not too much more. It's not a means of gaining new knowledge. This is the challenge, but what I've just presented as the notion of Shabda from those 2 quotations is actually just one part of the picture. And in fact, if we look at Jiva Goswami's notion of scriptural testimony, it's far more complex than what I just said it was. It's nuanced, and in fact, we see that there are numerous chinks in the armor of Shabda. He himself creates a space for empirical observation and inference to affect how we know the world. He considers them real pramanas, not merely supportive. So I've got 6 places, 6 chinks in the armor, 6 locations where space is created by Jiva, looking at his work on the Sarva-samvadini. And I just want to run through them really quickly. And if any of you are interested in any one of those spaces, please feel free to talk to me afterwards or ask a question. I'll be happy to discuss further. But I won't dwell on them for too long, given our time limit here. So the first question that rises right away in any thinking person's mind is to ask, well, what constitutes Shabda? What can we put in the category of scriptural revelation? And the obvious candidate is there, first and foremost. It's the Vedas, okay, these sources of eternal knowledge and wisdom. But then what's very interesting is just in the next paragraph, Jiva Goswami says, but besides the Vedas, we should also include other authoritative works such as medical texts, Vaidya Shastra. And then he raises an objection from someone on the conservative Shabda side, saying, one may argue that they, medical texts, are unsanctioned like other works because there is no evidence to prove their authority. But we say no. We can accept these additional texts as scripture because they faithfully follow the Vedas. Now, I find it really interesting that of all the different types of reliable knowledge that he could use, he chose medical texts. Because that is one area of knowledge that from the beginning of human history we know is very susceptible to change and observation, right? He didn't use astrology, he didn't use metallurgy, he didn't use any number of sciences that would have been current in his time. He used medical texts where observation, input, experimentation, and growth of knowledge over time would have been very common, even in his day, in the 16th century. So the question I want to raise, and again, we won't discuss this further, is if Shabda is knowledge from a trusted source, which is how he defines it, then in some way, perhaps not on the level of Veda, but in some way, can reliable scientific knowledge be placed in the category, the second tier of Shabda, of trusted knowledge from a non-divine or indirect divine origin, rather than the direct origin of the Vedas? Point number 2, the second question or chink in the armor, is quoting from approvingly from the great Advaitin, impersonalist commentator Vachaspati Mishra. Jiva affirms that scriptural evidence does not negate the authority of sensory perception in ordinary worldly matters. If it did, then we would have no way of accessing scripture at all, since we rely on our senses to hear and understand scripture accurately. So he says it doesn't deny the authority of sensory observation in ordinary matters, but only in special cases. And how does he define ordinary matters? He says pratyaksha, sensory observation, has authority everywhere and anywhere, except in certain special cases when scripture imposes itself on the physical world and decides to contradict. Okay? And what those special cases are when scripture does impose itself, you'll have to talk to me individually to find out. Since I'm down to 5 minutes, point number 3 is that he says scripture can impose itself in these special cases on sensory observation, but its primary domain, he says, is on those things not available to sensory observation. And he gives specific kinds of examples to show that when things cannot possibly be falsified by science because they are in a realm beyond scientific observation or physical observation, he says that's the primary domain of scripture. It's not the only domain. It does impinge on the physical world, but it is the primary domain where we ought to be using scripture. And again, this is, I think, very significant. In fact, he, like other Vedantists, defined this world as ashabdam. The physical world is that realm which is not known only through shabda. Therefore, it's called ashabda. Point number 4, Scripture is eternal and divine with no human author, but it is revealed to us through human sages. And so this creates a hermeneutical circle. Essentially, how do we get shabda? It's through pratyaksha, through the observation of those who are trusted. What is their observation? That's what produces shabda. So if you see what I mean, we have this hermeneutical circle, and in hermeneutics, circles are very valuable. That's how hermeneutics happens, is through these circles. So it's not circular thinking we're talking about here. We're talking about an interpretive circle, which is very useful. And then point number 5, how do we know that claims of scriptural descent are true, of divine descent of Scripture? Well, because it's coming from a trusted source. But how do we know that source is trusted? And in order to get out of circularity there, he says it's because we know that Shabda can be trusted because it's self-evident. Again, it's self-evident to human apprehension. And he gives this wonderful story of you are the 10th person. If you know this story, you'll know what I mean here. If you don't know it, come talk to me and I'll tell you the story. And then finally, point number 6, is that even when Scripture does impinge on the physical world, how do we understand it? How do we understand that contradiction, if there is a contradiction? And this goes into this wonderful area of interpretation. There's Sanskrit literature is very detailed in its ability of interpretive criticism. And there's direct and indirect meanings of Scripture. Direct meanings are always preferred, but indirect meanings, sometimes non-literal meanings, can be used in particular circumstances. Those circumstances, one of them is when the direct meaning is implausible because it does not match with our observation of the world. Okay? And the famous example is the village on the Ganges. The text says the village is on the Ganges. The idea of human habitation in the middle of a river is unlikely to our experience. Therefore, we add an interpretive element there to say that the village is on the banks of the Ganges, taking an indirect interpretation. He does one more, which is really cool. One of the statements of the Vedas is that the stones float. Okay? And he says the idea that stones float doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us in direct observation, but this statement is made by the Vedas in order to increase the ritual power of the stones within the Vedic sacrifice. So in religious studies terms, he's essentially giving a functionalist explanation for the idea that, for a scriptural statement, that the statement itself is true, but it's true because of its function rather than its ontological claim that stones are floating. Just in case you're wondering, he does give the example of the bridge of Lord Rama as an example of stones floating, but he says that's not a general situation, our experience in life. In general, this is used to increase the ritual potency of stones. Okay, so these are my 6 points. I just want to say that the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition is one that distinguishes itself from impersonalism with the idea, the conviction that we live in a real world, right? That the world is real. Let us not eviscerate that commitment to the reality of the world by completely stifling the space for pratyaksha, for genuine engagement with the world. Why is the world real? Jiva Goswami says the most important reason is that it is available to our senses. And I think that's the space, that's the primary space we have for engagement, for taking seriously empirical observation as a source for valid knowledge. Thank you so much for your attention.
I'm going to take 2 questions and be done. We will take 2 questions, and whoever they are, I'll call up. Unless everyone's too hungry to even have it. Who has a question? Anybody have a question? We'll just not do the cards. It's so late. Kunal, you have a question? Yeah, come speak into the microphone then. Where's the portable one? Yeah. Okay.
I can just come here.
Yeah.
I think it's important for everyone here to note what exceptions there are when pratyaksha might rule over something that Shabda is trying to tell us. So, do you think you can tell everyone? That's my question.
Okay, so I perhaps built the suspense a little too much just in a hope that people might ask the question. So thank you for asking it. The exception, he says, is really simple. He says a shabda is to be taken seriously over and above empirical observation when it chooses to impose itself on the world. He says it does this in a few ways. One is that it provides a foundation for good inference, for good logic and reason. And by this he means that reason, logic, and even sensory observation cannot but function on the foundation of knowledge from a trusted source, right? So any logical inference we know from symbolic logic begins with premises. Those premises, they're premises by definition, but those premises rely on knowledge produced by others, right? You're not going to go back to ground principles of I exist, therefore I am, or I think, therefore I am, right from every time you build an argument. We take certain things for granted, and he says that is one of the roles of Shabda, to provide a foundation for good quality inference and trusted sensory observation. So I think that's significant. The second is to be supported by pratyaksha, that pratyaksha supports what Scripture says, and in the other direction, essentially. And then the third, he says, is overruling the others. And so that's only the third option, and he says that happens kvachit, sometimes. Sometimes Scripture does decide to overrule the other two. And in that case, we have to say, yes, sir, and we have to accept it and go along with it. So those are the key exceptions. As a foundation for the other two, being supported by the other two, and occasionally overruling. But let me just say, even the overruling can often be reinterpreted by point number 6 that I made, that sometimes when you reinterpret by a secondary meaning, then all of a sudden Scripture doesn't overrule our sense perception. Stones don't actually float because we reinterpret it. Or water does not speak. This is another example he gives. But the devas speak by reinterpreting it. So the occasions in Jiva Goswami's idea where Scripture is actually overruling, like in a genuine way contradicting regular human perception, is very little. When you come down to it, he wants to maintain the principle that Scripture can do it, but in reality there's very few circumstances in which it actually does.
Okay, one more question, or is there one there? Yes. I see the light's in my eyes, so I can't see who's raising their hand. If you have a question, just come forward to the front. Okay? I guess not. 3 announcements. Oh, yes. Sita? Yes. So it's broadcast.
Okay, my question is for Dr. Monilowski. I gleaned from your conclusion that through observation, 4D observation basically, that madhyama sound or mind sound has the capacity to cause matter to transform or change. I was under the impression that vicari sound or like material sound can also have that effect. So I was asking if you could maybe clarify or differentiate the madhyama and vicari in regards to its effect on matter.
As I understood the question is the difference between two levels, Vaikari and Madhyama level, yeah? And Vaikari, what we hear, it's a rough a level of sounds, it's a material world, 3D material world. But Madhyama's level of sounds is a computational world, a level of our mind. It's what we are thinking, it's a level of ideas. It's they can be described through mathematics, through computational science, and for example, I show you an example of mathematics with complex numbers. They can describe four-dimensional space that we cannot imagine. Using our geometry, we can imagine only 3D space. We cannot imagine four-dimensional space. And this is the difference. I hope I answer your question.
If not, let us continue that privately.
Yeah.
Okay. We will, let me see, I have 3 announcements to make. Thank you. Thank you very much. Their dinner's been canceled. There is a room 105 just out to my right, to your left, unless you're standing sideways, has a poster session, some works of art, other interesting things, some book signings available over there by the book table, and there will be some musical interlude while we're eating by Nadia somewhere, and we will have a dance performance at 8 for those who are totally mesmerized, and there will be movies shown downstairs, 2 different films. One is the one about the Yamuna, and they're both shorter films, I think each 20 minutes or something like that. And the other film will be on the Pear Project. And again, we'll show the Pear again tomorrow, 20-minute clip. A lot of people ask, what is that Pear Project of Brenda Dunn's? So that will be downstairs. Any questions, just ask me or one of the other staff members. What time is the film? Well, let me see. I would say in 30 minutes enough time. I told them to start at 7, but we ended a little later. We'll start a few minutes after 7, maybe as soon as between 7 and 7:10, as soon as enough people are there. Okay? Thank you very much. Have a good evening.